Okay. Um, yeah, so I've been having a lot of thoughts mm, about I think just like online credibility or credibility in general. And I think it kind of dawned on me after watching like a number of creators or content from different domains. And because in the end, I'm a person that consumes content on YouTube, on Instagram, a little bit on TikTok, but mostly on YouTube. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to just a lot of people that are not necessarily instructional content, but providing insights. And I think that distinction is kind of really important right now because the the understanding of authority and the concept of expertise is starting to become a little bit gray because people are becoming great storytellers and not becoming but being able to showcase the ability to explain a concept or to explain a idea or teach something to someone. And because they're able to explain it in a great way, in a storytelling way, and it's engaging and you feel like you've understood what they've said, we're starting to conflate the ideas of what is expertise, and it becomes more and more difficult to understand what is actually correct and what is just kind of like online personality and fluff. And my initial thoughts on this kind of were brought up when I was watching a podcast from Dwarkesh Patel with an AI researcher, Richard Sutton, who is, and by the title of the video, and I guess known within the industry as the grandfather of reinforcement learning. And they had like a really interesting conversation because Dwarkesh Patel comes from a background of large language models. He is interviewing a lot of kind of tech up and coming people who have a lot of success right now. And their success is hinging a little bit on the success of large language models. And so the vernacular and the vocabulary that he's using to describe the problems and the way that AI is solving these problems, specifically large language models, is it a little bit in contradiction to the way that Richard Sutton would characterize these things. And they came away with kind of some jarring or I don't know, discomforting, uncomfortable as a listener to be hearing them say, "Oh, I do not agree with the way that you've characterized that. My view is very opposite, and I'm surprised at how you see that." And when you kind of are listening to people that previously you assumed were kind of experts in their own right, and you have very conflicting thoughts on foundational ideas or fundamental ideas to each of their arguments, it starts to kind of like, okay, who is right here? Who is the one that truly understands this? And I think I'll come back to this, but I think this was also kind of touched on or poked into a different thought when there was this whole controversy within the fitness community around Mike Israetel and his PhD dissertation. So the context for this, or the background, I guess, is Mike Israetel is a kind of online persona who runs a coaching or fitness brand, Renaissance Periodization. And he kind of intros all of his videos with, "Hi, I'm Dr. Mike. I have a PhD in exercise science or sports science." And he uses this educational background, his PhD, as his credibility to kind of talk on all the different topics, to explain training mechanisms, to explain programming, and how people should approach exercise science. He is in this domain or realm of science-based lifters, whom there are many, but he kind of asserts that he has the most knowledge, the most background. He's a world-leading expert in his field, as he has said for himself. And it's really interesting when someone did Solomon, this other YouTuber from Australia, did a kind of breakdown of the dissertation that granted him his PhD, and it was kind of determined that it was kind of bogus science. It wasn't very well done. It didn't really meet any of the standards of what academia would require a PhD to have met. There was it was littered with spelling errors. There was inconsistent thoughts, and it was kind of mundane and not very novel. And yet still he has this PhD, and so he's been kind of like brandishing it as his credibility. And now it's like, okay, so if this is a bit of a farce and it doesn't really support the narrative that he is this world leading expert in fitness, who can you trust? Because there was already a little bit of a movement of within the fitness industry of like, who is really credible, who really, like, it was always kind of assumed because academics or post-secondary education or these titles of prestige are what establishes someone to be an expert. And so PhD or postdoc or this like this rigor of academics is kind of the standard for establishing yourself as someone who really understands a topic. And after this kind of like deconstruction of his PhD thesis, it's kind of like, wow, this maybe isn't the credibility, or in this instance shouldn't be the credibility that he's kind of, or we've been led to believe. And I think the reality within fitness is that it's a unique microcosm of academia or of a domain of expert, because there's essentially three tribes of expertise within fitness. There's the really gifted athlete who, I'll call it maybe sweat equity, has created credibility for themselves. So they're performative. They've created a physique that somebody else would admire and somebody else wants to figure out how to have. They're able to do something really impressive. So this is like someone, I don't know, Larry Wheels is someone who's like that, where he has insane feats of strength, but yet he also has an incredible physique. There's people that are able to do 100-mile marathon runs, fast people that jump a lot. So when you're able to demonstrate something because of your abilities, it's granting yourself this like secondary pathway to credibility. And so it doesn't really matter for a lot of people what academic background or what your studies are, because you're able to demonstrate that you can do a specific thing. And it's implied that since you can do it, you should be able to teach someone else how to do that. The second tribe is as coaches, or people that are able to express and explain in a storytelling way, in a convincing way, that they know how to do something. And so a lot of these coaches don't necessarily have the current ability. They're not able to demonstrate that if you do this, you'll have this right now. But they're able to explain in a way that's understandable and can convey that if you follow their advice, that you should arrive to a point. And so this also is like an intermediary, because you don't necessarily need a background in academics or to have studied something. But if you can connect with your audience in a way, you can explain and extol the expertise that you have, and it's convincing. And then there's a kind of third tier in the same exercise where these are the true academic, where they don't necessarily have a background. They don't necessarily know how to explain it in a practical way, but they're able to understand what the established science is. And there's a lot of people that are like this, but they don't also have the genetic or athletic ability to demonstrate it. And so I would say that these are kind of three tiers of expertise. And the thing that also muddies the water as well is you have performance enhancing drugs. So you have these people that are explaining that you can do all of this stuff and then hiding the fact that they're taking performance enhancing drugs. So it's also creating this false narrative of what is possible by following the instructions. And I think that this is such a difficult thing to navigate, because you don't really understand who is an expert. You don't understand what information you can trust. And I think the thing that this whole deconstruction of Mike's PhD thesis, it has created whether or not there'll be this kind of like lingering impact, in my eyes, it's created this very negative, there's already a feeling of like, you don't need to have an expertise to be able to teach. A lot of the stuff is intuitive or common sense. And there's already a very anti-science movement within fitness where it's like, yeah, you don't need to do everything to the degree of science, or all this stuff is over the top and unnecessary, because fitness is something that's more fundamental. And so by creating this narrative of, or not even a narrative, by demystifying the fact that his PhD was built on something that was inherently unscientific and not very well done, it delegitimizes the idea of academics in general for a lot of people. And so while this may be true for fitness, it's not necessarily true for other industries. For example, it's very hard to have a PhD in chemistry, and if you're trying to like moonlight as a expert in chemistry without demonstrating that you can do that, you don't have the same degree of sweat equity where you can just like fake it by doing something. I don't know how else to explain that, but there's not very many industries where you can do something to that effect. What else was I going to say? Mm. And I think the thing that I'm most fascinated by right now is that this current wave of technology is AI is kind of the ultimate disruptor in this, because a lot of people are realizing that they can learn something for themselves without needing to consult an expert, without needing to go to school, without needing to do a lot of the traditional pathways of becoming an expert. And whether or not you become an expert by using AI is another question. But the sense of expertise that AI kind of passes on to you by explaining things in such a way that you understand, giving you a tool set to be able to execute on something, it's really changing the landscape of what we view as an expert in society. I mean, we already have this kind of like pseudo gateway of expertise where you have people that are able to speak on a topic and project the idea of expertise. But now you don't even need to do that. You don't even need to listen to someone explain something. You can just talk to AI and have a plan generated for you. And so, in a way, I think coming back to the initial podcast for AI between Dwarkesh Patel and Richard Sutton was that the thing that really strikes me is that Richard Sutton is discrediting the skyline or the horizon of what is achievable with large language models. And he thinks that the current paradigm of starting with a large language model and scaling is something that is destined to fail, because it doesn't build on what is established as animalistic intelligence. And the principles in which AI learns, or in which a large language model gets trained, doesn't have the same reasoning or capabilities of what we've established or believe animalistic intelligence to have. But the reality is, large language models have been able to achieve a lot. They've been able to kind of mimic the idea of intelligence. And whether or not they follow that pattern or exemplify exactly the definition of intelligence, they're still able to do a lot and continually improving. And so at this point, it becomes like, okay, if your concept or your assertion of what is the essential paradigm or what is the better paradigm doesn't have a pathway of productivity, because at this point they don't have the same level of performance, like the ideas or the assertion of reinforcement learning. And when you ask, and I think this was one of the better questions in this interview was, okay, so if you take this idea for reinforcement learning, how does that scale? How do you scale that so that it has productivity? And this was something that he kind of danced around this question but never really answered it. And he recently gave a talk at his university on a kind of like framework to scale reinforcement learning. And we'll see if this has any sort of gravity to it, if it takes off. but we can already see the gravity of large language models and what they're able to achieve. And so I think that there is in a sense a bit of pseudoscience in large language models and AI, in the same way that there's a bit of pseudoscience in exercise science. But we over-index on the things that are tangibly real. Like we can see or we can experience what a large language model does, what these algorithms, whether or not we understand them or not, what they're able to do for us. And whether that is indeed true intelligence, as we have defined it previously or established within academia, is almost irrelevant, because we're able to see the result of this process. And for exercise is the same, is that whether or not you follow a structure that's specifically science-based, you end up getting a result if you follow that pathway. And so that's where the contradiction or these doubts of whether it's irrelevant to be an expert or to have such kind of like science-based approaches to certain things starts to, I don't know, creep into a lot of people that are interested in learning or pursuing or engaging with these fields. And so I think that for these topics in particular, I feel I have a sense of a filter, a way of understanding what makes sense to me, and I push back on certain things. And there was an influencer, a sports person that was a sports person, a fitness coach or an online influencer that does coaching, but he's also a very gifted athlete and performative. And he had created this video that was explaining why there's still a need for long form cardio. And he was kind of debunking or discrediting this study that was, I think it's called the Takama, these sprints, that was this sprint regime of high intensity training that was developed by a Japanese scientist in the 1990s. And it was based on a training program for the Japanese national speed skating team. And so what they were trying to demonstrate was, by following this program, how it would impact your VO2 max. And essentially, this study was, we want to take the program that the Japanese national speed skating team is doing and create a study around that to try and validate or justify whether this program or approach is having the effect that we're thinking that we're seeing. And so they created a study following this that was not using the same participants of the speed skating national team, but rather a subject, I think it was around 40 subjects of varying degrees of expertise and proficiency in athletic level. And they came away with some findings. And I think it was like in a 6 to 8 week period following this program, they saw improvements of somewhere between 9 and 15% in your VO2 max. But in the original video that this guy had created was saying that when you take this study at face value, you don't really realize the underlying mechanisms for the study. And he was asserting that the reason for the study, the reason for the results was because he was stating that the study was using the speed skating national team athletes, and that they were concluding their off-season training and just starting to get back into their regular season training while they were doing the study. And so he created this narrative, basically debunking the study by saying that the subjects were not necessarily, they were kind of cherry-picked for the study. But when I started looking into the study, this was not founded in any fact. And in fact, during this video, he had linked another video of someone that was saying that the findings from the study are not necessarily legitimate due to the participants that were involved. But in that video, they were asserting that the improvement in VO2 max was because specifically that this subject group was in the lower end of athletic ability. So they're trying to kind of assert that this 9 to 15% of VO2 max improvements was because these people were not doing something aerobically intensive before. And so they're getting pseudoscience called beginner gains. They're getting those initial improvements at a more rapid rate because they don't have this foundation of performance. But this guy, Alec, had linked this video, but was using a different argument than the original video. So he created this entire narrative added credibility by linking a video that was supporting his narrative in title, but then used a different argument, and then created an entire false narrative about why the study is wrong. And so this is a person with tens of thousands of followers on Instagram and on YouTube, and has, I don't actually know what his academic background is, but he's highly performative. He has an insane physical ability. He's super strong. He's super athletic, and he demonstrates the benefits of doing his program. But whether or not it comes from the program itself or because he's just an insanely gifted athlete is something that I always had questioned. And then when he's starting to make these assertions where they're just factually wrong, it's like, okay, now I'm starting to trust even less. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, is that once you lose credibility, or when someone loses credibility in this way, it becomes very hard to get it back. And I think the same thing happened to me recently, where I really like this one podcast where they talk about finance, marketing, and kind of like the landscape of capitalism in a sense. And it's through the lens of three people that are kind of the same age as me. The podcast is called Lemonade Stand, shout out. And I really think that they have really base takes. They explain things in a very understandable and logical way. And in general, I would say that I take what they say as mostly facts or factual, and I accept what they say. And it wasn't until recently that they had a guest on who was the main character. I forget his name at this point, but the main character from The Big Short. And he was the person that was able to forecast the kind of like financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and understanding where these kind of like financial pitfalls as it relates to mortgages and loans. And they were having a conversation with him, and one of the hosts had presented this idea of what he thinks are going to be the next financial potential breakdown similar to The Big Short. And it was really interesting where you're having this conversation or listening to this conversation between the podcaster and this kind of like financial expert. And he was very much like, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know if you really have the same insights as I do. So he kind of gently demystified and said, well, I think what you're saying has a logical truth and makes sense to kind of come to the conclusions or assertions that you're making, but it doesn't necessarily factor in everything. And so having worked in finance, having worked in private equity, the things that I'm more concerned about are not what you're describing as kind of like modified loans and these compounding effects and this mislabeling and continuity of these compounded or modified loans. It's more so the things that we don't get to see, because the regulations, as he sees it, have really improved since the financial crisis in 2009. And so for him, everything that this podcaster had brought up was not necessarily irrelevant, but he just didn't see it in the same way. And it was for me a moment where I was like, oh, wow, the person that I've been listening to on this podcast, it's not that they don't have the expertise or credibility that I thought they did. It's just that I hadn't listened to them in contrast to someone that does have the actual credibility that I was thinking. And so, I don't know, it's a very nuanced and interesting thought. But anyway, this is the first video for my channel. I want to continue talking on these kind of topics and just sharing the insights that I have, because I like listening to a lot of people talk on specific things about fitness, about AI, about finance. And I think that people have a lot of great insights, and I just want to add my voice to it's a room full of voices at this point. Everyone has a podcast, and I think more and more people are kind of inspired to have their own platform to share. And yeah, so if you're interested, if you enjoyed this, I mean, this was long form and rambling, but if you enjoy any part of this, leave a comment, subscribe, and yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.